He stood on my porch holding a cardboard carrier and a towel, and he smelled of diesel and too much cologne. He said the dog was a favor from Harold, that Harold had arranged it before the funeral because he thought I would be lonely. I remember the way the light from the kitchen pooled on his jacket, the faint metallic click of the carrier latch, and the rustle of straw when the dog nosed his way free. My name is Margaret, and this is my story. It begins with the smell of wet fur in an empty house, and with my sister-in-law smiling like she had the right to decide how I should grieve. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and if you ever took in an animal you did not expect. I want to know how many of you are listening from city apartments or from small towns like mine. Now, back to the day Harold was buried, and to the slow, steady way things that belong to you can be rearranged by someone who says they are helping. Harold was practical, the sort of man who folded his socks in the drawer and labeled the canned goods. We had been married for 38 years. He loved his garden, the way the sun hit the hydrangeas in late afternoon, the ritual of his nightly mug of tea. When the hospice nurse told me his breathing had changed and then stopped, the world folded into the small, neat square of our bedroom. There was the funeral, the black suit, my daughter Emma crying with her hands braced against her knees, and my sister-in-law Denise looking at me with what I later learned was calculation in her eyes. At the wake, Denise put a hand on my arm and said softly, "I have something that will help you get through this." And I believed her. Because when you are old, you want to believe in kindness. People came by with casseroles, with stories about Harold working late at the post office, with flowers and with condolences that tasted like wrapped paper. Tom from next door brought over the newspaper clipping he had found. Mrs. Patel from across the street stopped by and hugged me. Maria from the shelter left a card and said she would check in about the dog. It all felt like part of the ritual. I did not notice the small adjustments until they began to make a pattern. The dog arrived with no tempering explanation. He was a big, brindle mutt with one eyelid slightly drooped and an uncanny tendency to stare at the garden as if memory had planted a map there. Denise said Harold had always wanted me to have a companion and that she had sorted everything with a friend of Harold, a man named Lucas, who drove it over. Lucas had a way of speaking that made me feel safe. He patted the dog and said, "He knew your garden already, as if the animal had been bred for me." I called him Oscar because Harold once liked black Oscar coffee at the diner on Main. Oscar settled into the house the way a quiet relative might, nosing into the kitchen at dawn and sleeping on the chair where Harold used to sit. At night, I would hear him breathe, and the house would feel less hollow. Yet some things were off. Denise started stopping by more often. She would sit and drink the tea Harold kept sweet and ask me about bank accounts and about whether I had thought about selling the car. I thought she was worried about me. She said, "I only want to help," and she smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. Early on, Denise suggested changes. She asked if I would let her help with the garden, if it would be all right to have someone come in once a week to do light yard work. I remember the texture of the soil under my nails the first time I let her prune the roses. She did it slowly, like someone tracing a map. Ben, the retired detective who lived 2 streets over and who had once been Harold's bowling partner, stopped by because he liked to check in. He said he could keep an eye on things, that if I ever felt uncomfortable to call him. Ben deposited his key with me, like a talisman. The neighbor, Mrs. Patel, offered to water the plants when I went to the funeral and said, "Don't worry about the front, Margaret. We will watch your place." I believed in the fellowship of small-town hands. I did not think we were building a picture that would hide something. Soon, the signs began to thread themselves together. Oscar would stand at the back gate and look down the lane as if listening for a voice only he could hear. At times, he would paw at the soil in a corner of the garden, as though remembering the shape of something buried there. Denise would say, "That is his habit. He is just possessive of the place he likes," and laugh it off. Emma called late one night and said, "Mom, Denise was here again. She asked if she could keep an eye on you." And I remember telling her to be grateful, to let people in. The truth was, I was tired. Grief makes you sloppy with your boundaries. But also, small things started to disappear. A packet of Harold's favorite tobacco vanished from the top drawer. A stack of old letters that Harold had treasured was moved from the shelf to a box in the garage. Denise said she was organizing, making sure everything was in order. I nodded and thought of Harold's letters as paper that a widow could redeploy for the sake of moving on. I told myself that, of all the strange things happening, nothing was criminal. I was wrong. The first big break in the pattern came the night the dog went missing. I woke to the sound of shoes on the porch, to the scraping of something being dragged across wood. My chest tightened because Harold used to wake like that sometimes and call my name when his dreams got rough. It was Denise. She stood at my kitchen door, holding the cardboard carrier again, but this time she held a small wooden urn in the crook of her arm, like it was a prize. Her hand trembled, and there was dirt under her nails. She said in a voice I would later replay until I could barely bear it, "I had to do it for you, Margaret. It was the humane thing." She set the urn on the table, and it made a dull clack. I remember the metallic tang of the urn's lid as if it had a cold smell. My hands felt like they belonged to someone else. I asked where Oscar was, and she looked at me with that same practiced pity and said he had to be put down, that he had acted aggressively, and that Lucas had assisted. I remember the shiver of my chair as if it had recorded my disbelief. I said, "Why would he do that? He never hurt a soul." And Denise said, "He attacked the postman. He bit someone, and you do not want the kind of trouble an animal like that could attract." She cried a little, the sound of it false like the rustle of fake flowers. I held the little urn, and it felt heavier than its size. I traced the seam of the lid and murmured Harold's name like a plea. I let her tell me things because I wanted to be comforted. At night, I would cup the urn and sleep with it at my chest like an amulet. I put it on the mantel beside Harold's photograph, and I lit a candle. A week later, I found fur on the porch, a tuft of brindle hair stuck to the threshold. I asked Denise what it was, and she said she must have brushed him before the service. Her hands rubbed my shoulders like a nurse. I believed her. What else could I do? There were cracks in her story. Ben mentioned offhand that the postman, Miguel, had never filed a complaint. Mrs. Patel said she had seen Miguel the day the dog was supposed to have bitten him, and he had a bandage on his hand that looked like he was helping a neighbor with a thorn. Emma texted me a photo of Lucas at the workshop, smiling broadly in the same shirt he wore when he brought Oscar. I started to piece together inconsistencies, the way one might notice a loose tile in a roof only after the rain. One night, several afternoons after the urn was placed on the mantel, I woke to the sound of scratching at the bedroom window. Oscar was back at the gate, alive and muddy, and he dug with a fervor that made my knees wobble. The earth flew in fists and clods. The scent of wet soil and something metallic rose up against the cold air. He was digging right where Harold used to put his toolbox, right where Denise had been spending her time pruning. I opened the door in my robe, and the wet press of the night hit me, and the dog looked at me with eyes that were full of the map of the yard. My voice shook when I said, "Where have you been?" And Oscar wagged and barked, and his breath made little clouds. He nosed at my hand, and then he thrust his muzzle deeper and scraped until something metallic clinked. It was a small wooden box wrapped in duct tape and mud. I remember the sound of Denise's shoes on the porch like a countdown. She appeared behind me as if she had always been standing there and said calmly, "Margaret, you should not be digging around in the dark. You could catch your death." Ben arrived with his flashlight and said, "Let him dig, Margaret. Let him have it." The box slid from the soil like a secret being spin up, and I felt the smell of damp paper. Inside the box, there was a sheaf of envelopes, a small plastic packet of pills, and a folded note in Harold's handwriting. The note was short and messy, as if written in a hand that trembled. My name took up the first line, and then there was a list of sums and dates and the word accountant. I remember the sting of the soil on my bare feet and the way the streetlight threw Denise's face into a mask. We called the police. Detective Alvarez came with 2 officers, and the dog was a star from the start, sitting by the box with his head cocked and dirt between his ears. Lucas was brought in for questioning because he had been seen at the gate that afternoon. Denise stayed in the kitchen with her hands clasped like a woman waiting for hospital news. The box was taken in a paper bag. I watched as Officer Ruiz labeled evidence, and I felt the world tilt into a new kind of order. We sat in the living room and drank the tea Ben made while the 2 officers read through Harold's note. It mentioned a loan with dates that matched deposit into an account I did not know about, and the name Karen, who I later learned was an attorney in the county office. There were receipts for medication and a notation about cremation fees. The small plastic packet turned out to be pills that, when tested, did not match any prescribed to Oscar. The detective said in a calm, careful way that there were enough inconsistencies for them to open a formal inquiry. He asked if I had had any conversations that made me uneasy. I thought of Denise's neat hands and the way she had seized opportunities and said yes, but I did not tell the full truth about all the small things I had let slide. The investigation that followed was measured and exact. Detective Alvarez and Ben put their heads together and drew a map of visits and phone calls. They interviewed neighbors, including Mrs. Patel and Tom, and they pried into bank statements with warrants. They found transfers from an account Harold had once used to a different one that Denise controlled. There were emails from someone posing as Harold to a company that would provide cremation services, and the dates were tightly aligned with Denise's visits. The forensic analyst took the wooden box and ran tests, DNA from fibers, fingerprints, and soil samples, and the lab produced results with the cold clarity of a scale. In a short technical summary, the lab report stated that the soil composition in the box matched a patch of earth in my garden, that fibers from Denise's cardigan were found on the tape, and that trace elements of a commercial sedative were present in the residue. It was a procedural explanation, measured in laboratory terms, but for me it translated into a slow building of proof. The patrol log showed Lucas had been at my address the afternoon before the urn appeared. The detective said, "We need to follow the money and the movements," and I felt the comfort of process like a warm blanket. At this stage, I need to pause and say something to you, to anyone out there who has felt the sharp edge of doubt when trust has been expected. If you have ever suspected a loved one of wrongdoing, if you have felt your concerns brushed aside because you are elderly or because you are grieving, you are not alone. Share in the comments what made you suspect something. Start your answer with your city so we can see how these stories spread. People have told me in messages from Seattle and from small towns in the Midwest that when you speak the fear out loud, it loses some of its power. I promise to read. Your experiences matter because they make others brave enough to open the door to a garden and to let an old dog dig something up. The inquiry deepened. I spent afternoons at the kitchen table with Emma scanning through old bills and statements, and nights on the porch with Ben going over the timeline. Emma said, "Mom, you have to know what Harold put aside." And I said, "I thought I did." And she said, "We will sort it out. We will get him." Ben made calls to an old friend in records, and Detective Alvarez prepared to execute a search. It was strange to feel like the center of an investigation when only weeks before I had been the one making casseroles and receiving condolence cards. Part of me resented being under a microscope, and part of me was relieved that the truth was no longer allowed to be a rumor. Denise began to withdraw, her visits reduced to phone calls that were curt and clipped. Once she left flowers on the porch and no note. Often she would say, "I am only trying to help with the funeral arrangements," and it sounded hollow when she said it. There were moments of everyday tenderness that kept me anchored. Oscar would rest his head on my knee and slobber the tip of my slipper, and Emma would come over and braid Harold's scarf into a band to tie the roses. Maria from the shelter came by with a booklet about grief and support groups, and Dr. Chen, a veterinarian who had once treated our cat, came to look at Oscar and to verify his injuries. Dr. Chen was patient and careful, his hands warm on Oscar's flank. He said quietly, "He shows no signs of having been aggressive recently," and I remember the way his mouth tightened. He asked if Oscar had been given anything recently, and I thought of the pills found in the box and told him what we knew. Dr. Chen arranged to take a blood sample from Oscar and to check him over. It felt comforting that a professional would look with clear eyes. His report noted bruising that might come from a scuffle, but nothing to indicate a dangerous breed aggression. The veterinarian's note became part of the file, and Detective Alvarez used it in his affidavit. Meanwhile, Emma and I unearthed more papers from the box in the garage, and they contained copies of receipts and a small stack of letters. One letter was addressed to Karen the attorney, and it said, "I am worried about money and about Denise," and the scrawl at the bottom was Harold's name. The stage was set for a careful operation. Detective Alvarez planned a meeting with Denise under the pretense of discussing funeral costs. He wanted to observe her reactions and to have Lucas present. Ben would be there as a witness, and Officer Ruiz would be parked down the street with a camera. The plan required timing and patience, because when you are taking on people who try to manipulate grief, you cannot simply yell and point. You have to prove intent. There was a long procedural description that the detective read to me in a way that made me feel both safe and weary. He explained how they would serve a warrant for the residence where they believed Denise stored documents, how they would seize electronic records, and how they would take statements. The step-by-step was sterile in its terms, but tender in its caution. It reassured me that the law has a rhythm, and that rhythm can usher in a kind of justice. The confrontation came on a Wednesday. Denise arrived with a bouquet and a smile that seemed like protest against sorrow. She sat in my kitchen and said, "I wanted to help sort the paperwork," and her fingers were busy arranging the flowers as if to show competence. Lucas hovered by the doorway and seemed nervous. Detective Alvarez introduced himself and said he was sorry to add stress, but that there were concerns about financial transactions. Denise's face shifted as if a shadow had crossed it, and she said sharply, "This is absurd. Harold trusted me, I helped him, and I have nothing to hide." Ben, sitting quietly in the corner, folded his hands. Officer Ruiz asked a few direct questions, and then, before she could compose a full lie, the detective said we had a warrant and they were going to ask that she accompany them to the station. Her composure fractured in that sweet, angry way people adopt when caught. She accused us of persecuting her, of being cruel, and I sat like someone in the front row of a play, my heart pounding as if Harold were still breathing beside me. They took Denise's phone and took photographs of the bouquet and the kitchen table, and then moved to execute the search at her home. There is a particular sonic texture to a house being processed by the police. There were gloves, the crackle of plastic bags, the clink of metal trays. Detective Alvarez found documents in a hidden folder that matched the handwriting on some of the notes in Harold's box. There were transfers traced to accounts in a bank across town, and email communications that arranged for a cremation company to be contacted under a false name. The forensic tech described in 300 words the way they had sifted through hard drives, recovered deleted emails, and matched metadata timestamps to cell tower pings. It was work of patience and care, and the kind of attention that feels like a public tender mercy. While they worked, Oscar slept in the hall, his mud-caked paws folded neatly. Denise was brought in for questioning, and her story unraveled like a poorly knit sweater. At first, she accused me of bringing police into the house, and then she accused Lucas. Then she tried to place blame on a vague community of people, saying, "You do not understand how things were." But when the detective presented dates and transfers and the note that Harold had written with a list of charges, her shoulders drooped. Lucas, for his part, said he had been asked by Denise to help move Oscar because she wanted the dog nearby for the funeral, and that he had nothing to do with the paperwork. He looked smaller than I remembered. The interviews were long, and in the end, the weight of the paperwork and the forensics pressed into her story. She was charged with financial exploitation and with deception related to the handling of Harold's remains. In court, she pleaded not guilty at first and then later reached a plea that recognized the fiscal manipulations. The judge spoke plainly about trust and responsibility and sentenced Denise to a period of restitution and supervised community service, and in a separate hearing, ordered that she had to answer civil claims regarding the funds. To hear the word sentence was like hearing the lock click on a long open drawer. The arrest was not cinematic in the way television makes it. It was small and bureaucratic, and yet it carried a heavy moral weight. Officer Ruiz read the charges in a voice that made each syllable a small bell. Denise was led away with a scarf that had once been Harold's wrapped loose about her neck. She looked at me from across the squad car, and her expression was not the rage I had imagined, but something thinner, like paper left to weather. I thought of all the times she had brought casseroles and mercy trimmed in the shape of convenience. I thought of the urn on the mantel and the small wooden box that had been forced back into the soil by truth. Emma held my hand and said, "Mom, you were brave." And for the first time since the funeral, I felt like the air cleared enough that breathing did not hurt. There were technical steps after the arrest that are important and that some of you might find useful. The forensic process involved labeling, imaging, and securing of all digital evidence. Odds are, if you are dealing with suspected financial exploitation, records will be in multiple formats. Investigators used a forensic imaging tool to create exact copies of hard drives and phones so the originals could remain untouched. Bank transfers were traced with subpoenas that required bank compliance, and the lab matched handwriting with samples obtained legally during processing. That step-by-step may sound dry, but it is what turns suspicion into prosecutable evidence, and it is worth the insistence because documentation beats memory in the end. The media in our town picked up the story, and neighbors took sides. Some wrote letters on Denise's behalf saying she had helped the community. Others said they have always felt something off. I received typed letters from a woman named Karen who said she had represented Harold on an estate question and who gave testimony that confirmed the existence of separate accounts and odd withdrawals. Maria from the shelter organized a small fundraiser, and people from our church donated to cover Harold's remaining funeral costs. Oscar became a quiet celebrity for a time, the dog with a dirt streak on his muzzle who had found a box. He slept on the old rug and sometimes would place his head on my foot as if to anchor me. I planted a rose bush where he had dug, not to punish the earth, but to plant memory. There are complicated threads in families, and public shame does not erase tenderness. Emma and I had to rebuild the parts of our lives that Denise had rearranged like a careless housekeeper. It took afternoons of paperwork and nights of calls with attorneys, and there were hearings where I sat and watched Denise in a room, and each time she looked like someone slowly unwinding. 1 month after the arrest, life had the faint restoration of routine. I began going to a grief support group on Thursdays where a woman named Joy would bring soft cookies and lend space for people to talk about bones and birthdays. I planted the rose bush and it pushed up small green leaves. Oscar had gained weight and his brindle coat shone when sunlight hit it. Emma arranged Harold's medals in a small shadow box and placed it on the mantel beside the urn that now had an explanation. I went to the attorney's office with Emma and listened to the slow arithmetic of restitution. Denise had been ordered to return certain funds and to attend counseling. The community still whispered, My neighbors, including Tom and Mrs. Patel, would stop by with tea and bring up small jokes about Harold's gardening tips. These small moments did not make up for the theft of trust, but they began to buffer the jagged edges of my fear. 3 months later, we were in court for the civil matters, and the judge signed orders that formalized what had been pieced together. The financial restitution was not a cure, but it acknowledged a wrong. Emma and I met with a counselor who helped us set up new banking arrangements and a joint account that required 2 signatures. We also met with Detective Alvarez to understand what else could be done, and he suggested I update my will and secure documents in a safe deposit box. We planted more roses in the back garden as a ritual, and Emma brought a small wooden bench to sit on when she read aloud to me. Oscar would lie at our feet and sometimes lift his head as if he understood the language of legalities. The town had conversation about elder exploitation at the library, and Maria helped organize a workshop. We began to see that the pain we suffered could become a resource for others to avoid similar harm. 6 months on, the house felt lived in again in a different way. The mantel held Harold's photograph, the small wooden box now empty but kept in the top drawer as a lesson. Denise had paid some restitution and had completed required community service. She was not banned from our lives by law, but she had been banished in a social manner that can be both mercy and punishment. Emma had started a garden club with Mrs. Patel and Tom, and they met every Saturday, bringing biscuits and lending hands to anyone who needed pruning. I found myself speaking to a neighbor named Karen who had once been Mr. Harold's accountant and sharing strategies for protecting assets and for noticing early signs of abuse. The legal case had closed with an understanding that was not total closure, but it was enough to light the way. If you asked me what kept me steady through those 6 months, I would say it was the small rituals and the dog. To feel Oscar's weight on my knee in the morning was like feeling the hand of someone who remembered that a life is composed of touch and routine. I found new strength in asking questions and in naming things. Where before I had been polite and relieved when someone offered assistance, now I asked for documentation, I kept records, and I let Ben help without assuming he would do everything. I learned how vital it is to listen to your instincts and to put practical safeguards in place. I also learned that even the smallest acts of kindness are not always what they seem, and that grief can be weaponized by those closest to us. But I also found that community could be armored with love and justice when people like Detective Alvarez and Ben and Dr. Chen and Maria showed up not to judge but to help the truth find a way into daylight. The final scene of this story is quiet. On a late afternoon, I sat on the bench Emma brought and watched the roses move in the wind. Oscar nosed at a toy and then settled into a patch of sun. A patrol car drove by slowly, and I felt the residual ordinariness of a life that had been corrected. I thought of Denise in the way you think of a cloud that once covered your face and then drifted away. She had been part of the life Harold and I built, and her betrayal was deeply painful. Yet the revelation made room for new tenderness and for action that mattered. If you are watching and thinking this could never happen to you, I would ask that you do one small practical thing this week. Check who has access to your financial accounts and consider adding a trusted second signature or setting up alerts for transfers. Talk to a friend or a neighbor about the people who visit frequently. These steps are ordinary, but they have the power to prevent an extraordinary pain. If this story touched you, if you have sat with a jar of grief and thought someone had rearranged your life for their gain, please subscribe to the channel. We share stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary betrayals and who found their way to justice and to repair. By subscribing, you join a community that believes in supporting one another, in sharing resources like local legal clinics and shelter contacts, and in amplifying voices that are often quieted. Your registration helps us produce more episodes where we bring experts to explain steps you can take and survivors who can give testimony from experience. If you cannot subscribe right now, consider leaving a comment with the city you are in and one small sign that made you suspicious in your own life. Your comment might be the lifeline another person needs to see they are not alone. Thank you for listening. Perched on the porch, I sometimes talk aloud to Harold as if telling him about the garden now, about how the roses have come back stronger and how Oscar digs in the corner like a small, effective historian. I finish the day with a cup of tea and the radio low in the background, and I feel the sort of steady grief that is more like an old companion than a wound. The garden is my memorial and my proof that life persists. I keep the small wooden box on the top shelf because it reminds me that some truths must be dug up, and that sometimes a dog knows more about loyalty than people do. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: trust your senses, document what you can, ask for help, and do not let grief make you quiet when questions remain. The truth has a way of returning to the surface, often with muddy paws and an insistence that cannot be ignored.